How does consciousness relate to ancient history? Have you ever asked that question in your entire life? No, of course not. And why would you, right? The concept of consciousness is not something that we generally think about when we go into our ancient historical studies. I mean, how many times has anybody ever, in any kind of history you've ever read, bring up the fact that, hey, consciousness was a thing that these people were dealing with, and we really had to look into it, and we really got to figure it out if we're going to understand our ancient past. Nobody is doing that. And the reason why nobody is doing that, because the two topics, ancient history and consciousness, seem to be essentially not related. I mean, if we just ask the basic critical thinking question of something like that, how are they related? And the initial answer that we would come to is that we could just say something simple to the tune of, well, I mean, we think we're conscious today, and so people like us today basically existed back during the ancient times. So, okay, great, we were both conscious, but who cares? I mean, why are you asking me this question? Why are you wasting my life with a stupid question like this? This question, in my opinion, is actually extraordinarily important in the context of this. Our ancestors, all of them have a creation story for humans. Now, really quick, before I go further, for all of you, all the new people or anybody who doesn't understand my position, I do not believe in God, and I do not believe, I don't have a belief. Like, I'm not trying to shill a particular theory here. I'm just asking questions. I'm just going to go through it. So don't think that this is some sort of a crazy, God creation thing. Okay, anyway, that's the warning. All right, so anyway, moving on. Now, the first interesting point that we see here is that we have all of these ancient cultures having some sort of a creation story, not only just for existence, but for humans as well. All right, and that story is generally told from a perspective as if humans were paradoxically there witnessing it. I've always found it fascinating that all of these creation stories are told from a very human witness perspective. I don't think a lot of people understand that that actually carries some fairly heavy connotations. I mean, if you think about it, it's pretty SchizO, right? It's like you're there to witness your own creation. How does that even happen? All right, okay, so what does this have to do with consciousness? All right, well, the fact that all of our ancient ancestors have some sort of a human creation story, that means that they also have an idea of where human consciousness started. And now, I mean, that's crazy. I mean, think about that. We have a huge problem right now in science with consciousness. The concept of consciousness is one you could debate for 10,000 years. And I am going to debate myself because I have nothing better to do. And nobody listens to this anyway, so it's quite irrelevant. So consciousness. So if the premise I just said, right? Humans essentially are saying that they witnessed consciousness coming into being. Now that statement is actually fairly heavy, because one of the huge problems just with trying to figure out humans in general is, where did this all start, right? So if you take the mainstream scientific perspective, well, we get all kinds of things even out of the mainstream. But the question is, at what point, does a human become conscious? At what point if you believe in evolution, at what point in evolution did humans achieve a level of whatever we would consider consciousness? Where did that start? At what point? Now, mainstream doesn't really have an answer for that at all, and in fact, this is like high-level mainstream. Anybody who claims in the mainstream that they can pinpoint when consciousness started, they've lost their mind. I mean, that person is a religious nut job in the mainstream scientific arena. We have no idea. We have no scientific evidence whatsoever that truly proves or points to a period of time where consciousness came into being. We don't have any idea. We have no evidence. There's nothing there. So if any mainstream person tells you that they have it all figured out, you can start choking them, just like slapping them. Just throw them across. Just take care of it, dude. Just show them that they are wrong, right? You can do it peacefully too, but sometimes you gotta slap them. All right. Okay. So this is a real issue with no real answer. And people generally just move on because there's no real answer. It doesn't even really matter what perspective you look at it from in the mainstream. We do not have a legit foundational scientific answer that says, yes, this is when consciousness spawned into life, and now that's why we are where we are now, and blah, 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 blah. So we do not have an answer, even on the mainstream side of things. Now that's pretty heavy, because our ancestors seem to know exactly when humans started, which means that our ancestors have a recording of when consciousness would have come into being. Now, that statement right there is why consciousness is important to take into account when we start thinking about ancient history, because apparently our ancestors already had this figured out. Nobody in the past, here's something interesting. Nobody in the ancient past is worried about consciousness. Now, you might try to say, well, yeah, but the Greeks were, philosophizing about consciousness and they were asking questions. No, that's not the history I'm talking about. I am talking about the true ancient origin stories that people came up with thousands upon thousands of years ago, way before the Greeks got into philosophy and all of that stuff. You see, it's funny, even in Greek philosophy, you actually find them questioning some of this stuff as well. It gets a little interesting in that regard. Anyway, so if our ancestors have an origin story for humans, they also have an origin story for consciousness. So what does that mean? Well, this means that if we are willing to take our ancestors' histories for what they are, right? If we take those mythologies and those legends, and instead of looking at them in a fictional light, if we instead look at them, hey, you know what? They actually meant what they said. Like, this is what happened, right? Somebody created man, basically, right? Somebody created life. Or something created man, and something created life. That's what all of the stories talk about. So that means, then, that something created consciousness. This puts us in a very unique position. Because here on this channel, what I like to do is I like to take everybody's, legends or mythologies or whatever you want to call it, whatever has basically been thrown into the fiction pile. I like to take those and just take them at face value. So if we start to take our histories at face value, not only do we find that the planets took a much larger role in human development, but it also means that we have an answer to one of the hardest problems that we know of in science, and that is, where did consciousness come from? All right, now, I get it. The first thing everybody's probably thinking right now is, okay, so what you're saying, dude, is that whatever weird god just created us and that's when it started? That's not what I'm saying. Remember, we don't have to put this in the context of a god. If you are putting something in the context of a god like that, that is a very particular psychological conditioning program that is being activated within your psyche. And I know that sounds schizo, but that's the truth. And if the first place you immediately go to is you want to blame creation on a mystical sky being or whatever, that's on you. I didn't say that. And what's even more interesting is that our ancestors don't necessarily say that either. Right? And that is something that isn't really thought about, because once again, that programming, that programming that triggers in everybody's head that creation equals God, that does not have to be like that. And our ancestors generally do not approach their ancient histories like that either. It's very important to remember that it's important to go read the actual stories, first of all, right? And it's important to go find as many different translations as you can of said story. Because what you find is you don't necessarily find, a god sitting there doing stuff. You find let's say a being. You find an individual or individuals creating humanity. All right, so we don't need a god for that. That's just our psychological programming saying that you have to think of a god when you think of a creator. We don't need to do that. Think of that scientifically, right? And we can take it one step further and say that it is not scientifically inaccurate to say that a human could be created. Now, we'll get into more of that in a sec. So let's go back to the histories. All right, so the written histories, they tell us about the creations and stuff like that. And I get it, most people are going to say something to the tune of, well, these people are crazy, they were just making stuff up, they were just trying to find answers for the weirdness in their world or whatever, right? The first thing to remember really fast is that there is no scientific, genetic disposition that would force humans to create an origin story or a creation myth at all. There's nothing in our genes that we know scientifically right now that demands that cultures do that demands that a human does that. All of our ancestors did it. That should not have been the case, statistically speaking. Now, given that all of our ancestors have a creation story of where humans came from, then you can ask, all right, well, fine, but they're all different. Then I would say, well, they're not really all different. And I'm not going to get into comparative mythology here. I just want to build a small foundation for us for the rest of this discussion, that all of our ancestors, for some weird reason, they all have very, very similar creation myths. All right, so I get it. So the opposite to that would be, well, I mean, yeah, I guess you could sort of look at it like that. But, I mean, those myths are really old. People have added to them. They've probably changed over time. Can we really believe those? And that is a very good question. And that's where things can get a little weird. But it would be, in my opinion, that if you were to take comparative mythology at face value and utilize it as a real science, that once you do, if everybody across the planet has a similar creation story, then we can probably at least pick out some of the main bullet points from those stories and probably say, hey, that's probably what happened, right? We can probably say that, right? So one of the main bullet points for our discussion here would be that humans are created by something else or someone else, right? That is a very common theme in creation stories, right? It might be told in different ways, but at the end of the day, it boils down to that concept, and it's that concept that's important. All right, so let's start looking at this subject from a critical thinking and a scientific method perspective. All right, so one of the things that we find if we use the scientific method in critical thinking is that we find and we can establish that at the very least, our ancestors make the claim that humans were created. And for some weird reason, the perspective is told from that of we were there to see it. All right, that's interesting. I'm not going to go too much further with that, I don't think, because we're not talking about that. We're talking about consciousness. I got to focus up. Okay, so within the written histories that we have, we can say, all right, at the very least, there is a common theme of humans being created. I know I've said that 3,000 times, but now we have that. Now, the other side and the other piece of evidence that we have from history would be oral tradition. Now, we have to take oral tradition seriously as well. Now, the first problem that we run into with oral tradition is that's the whole game of telephone problem, right? And I'm on board with that. I get that. You can play devil's advocate and with that concept, and that's a legitimate concept. But what I would also say, for those of you who do hate on oral tradition, there's something to be said about the possible accuracy that oral tradition has over the written word, right? If you're familiar with, I believe it's Socrates that did this. If I'm wrong, whatever. But I'm pretty sure it's Socrates. He did not write down anything that he talked about philosophically. He only spoke about it. And his methodology or his reasoning behind doing that was that if he were to write down, and this is basic for all of you crazy philosophers out there who are ready to dogpile me, this is basic, just let me do this. All right, so Socrates' his main theme was that if he were to write down whatever he was saying, right, whether it be a philosophy or a history or whatever, if he were to write that down, people would lose the true meaning of what Socrates actually was trying to say, because Socrates himself was not there to answer questions or to deliver the information in the very specific way that it should be delivered. Now, most people, when they hear this particular perspective, they don't really agree with it. There's immediate pushback on this kind of a way of thinking regarding the transmission of information. But think about this, and I'll do this really quick and then we'll go on. But the reality is, when you are there to talk to somebody, to convey a message to them, you have that ability to do things that the written word can't do. Right? So while we are going to be using written histories from way back in the day to build our foundation here for the consciousness thing that I'm eventually going to talk about, but it's important to note that even our written histories might be missing, or we just might be missing, crucial pieces of the understanding of what's truly going on, because the reality is we do not have anybody to ask questions to. We do not have anybody there who could point us in the right direction if we are interpreting something wrong. That is something that a lot of people, I don't think, really think about when they go and they read histories. Just because it's a written word, that does not mean that we are getting the true context out of whatever that original story was trying to convey. So with this in mind, we need to be able to look at oral tradition and take it seriously, because the cultures that pass down stories through oral tradition, they don't just say, hey, memorize these words and move on with life and just regurgitate them whenever somebody wants to hear them. That is not how oral traditions are generally taught in a culture, right? When people are told the oral traditions, the teacher is there to convey all of the emotions and all of the answers that the previous generation also had access to, right? And then it just continues on down the line. So when we look at an oral tradition, it's important for us not to discard it immediately because we think it would all just have gotten changed anyway. In fact, the reality is oral tradition might be able to possibly be more reliable than a written history. That's entirely possible, right? We can make a case for either side really being the best way to do it. But I just wanted to make that case so everybody understands that if we use oral tradition as a backbone for any piece of evidence, that it's legit. You can use it. Don't discard it just because it's an oral tradition. Okay. All right. So that means, at the end of the day, that means that our ancestors, whether they wrote it down or whether they conveyed it orally, that means that they are aware of when human consciousness spawned to life. Now, I know I've said it before already, but this is an important aspect of our ancestors' history. They are literally telling us that they know how, sort of when, depending on how we want to do the dates, but at the very least, they are telling us how we came into being and experiencing the world around us. So, what's the deal with consciousness, and why does this matter to history? All right, so basically what I've already said, that should already show you how much consciousness matters in a historical context, right? Our ancestors basically have an answer to the question that is driving, scientists crazy right now. So what is consciousness? Why does it matter? What's even the point of this anyways? Well, consciousness is how we experience what we experience, right? We consider a human conscious, and that conscious ability is what allows you to operate within the world around you at what we would consider a higher level. Yes, I realize there's going to be a smartass or two out there that's thinking like, oh, well, even molecules are conscious, and that rock is conscious, and all that blah, blah. Okay, I'm not going to argue any of that right now. I am specifically going to focus on human consciousness. Now, when we look at our ancestors' claim that they know that humans were created and that, by extension, consciousness was created, that already puts a weird spin on the concept of consciousness. And the reason for that is that it immediately calls into question some of the higher level theories regarding what consciousness is. So, like, for example, one of the theories is that everybody is just consciousness, like everything is consciousness, right? Like your hand is conscious, that rock is conscious. The entire existence is essentially a universal consciousness, and it is just experiencing itself. So if you find yourself in that particular category to where, everything is one and it's just consciousness observing itself or whatever's going on in that side of the crazy loony bin, suddenly our ancestors are telling you that no, that's not what's going on. Like that's not what consciousness is. Consciousness was created. Right? You don't need to have this weird, all-encompassing, universal consciousness experiencing itself, because that is not what it is. Consciousness relative to a human being is something that was created for a human being. Now, before I go on, I'm not talking garbage towards the people who actually believe that everything you see around you is consciousness experiencing itself. That is entirely possible. That situation I'm down with. My only problem with that particular view of consciousness is that it's very difficult to prove. In fact, it might be unfalsifiable. I think if you think that consciousness is, just it experiencing itself, how do you prove that? I mean, how do we know that? And you don't come to me start saying, well, I just know it because I know it, because I'm conscious and so that means I know it. Do not come at me with that. That is not a legit reason why you can have that belief. You gotta have some sort of real evidence for that, right? And I know you can start talking about maybe some sort of metaphysical thing, but at the end of the day, your premise has to be falsifiable. If it is an unfalsifiable premise, what do we do with that? So that's one of the problems with that angle. I'm still open to it, by the way. I'm not throwing that in the garbage. Calm down. Don't start, coming after me. You're fine for now. But to hold that position without keeping your eyes open for other positions, in my opinion, or the reality is a scientific fact, that's not the appropriate way to go. So just be careful with that. Anyway, but if you believe in that direction, things get weird because now you have our ancestors saying, no, it's none of that. We know how we started consciousness. There was some sort of a creator, and that creator imparted the capability of consciousness on us. And yes, I realize if you really want to be a douchebag, you can say, well, that's still just consciousness experiencing itself in its own right. We're not going down that route, right? We're not going down. I'm not doing that. So we're just going to push that to the side because we're not doing that. All right. But that is a legitimate problem because that means that we have people telling us, our ancestors telling us that there is indeed a starting point, which means or infers that there was already something else going on before human consciousness came into being. Now, that's okay, so that brings us into the next part of consciousness. You have a whole other group of people or a whole other club of people who believe that that consciousness is physical. It's a materialistic situation. What I mean by that is that consciousness is generated by your brain. Right, so your brain is sitting there, it's thinking. The physical capabilities of your brain are what generate what we call consciousness. Now, this premise has some merit. I mean, we can, there's nothing weird necessarily about saying that the brain is what generates consciousness, but there are problems with the materialistic perspective. So if you currently believe, and you're 100% physical, and your brain is generating your consciousness, it's generating your thoughts, like everything originates in your brain. I guess that's the better way to put it, is that everything starts there. And I think most people probably believe that anyway. Even if you believe in God, you probably are still a form of materialist in the sense that your brain is generating the consciousness. Okay, we should start a drinking game. Every single time I say the word consciousness, you do a shot, or you do a line, or you smoke some crack. You know how we'll explore consciousness on a whole other level doing that. All right, so anyway, so it's entirely, where was I? Okay, so we have the brain possibly generating consciousness. Now, and there's a whole, there's a field of study on that, right? Now, the problem with this perspective is that the more that field of study studies it, the more scientific experiments that have been done on the brain to try and prove that the materialistic perspective is real, the more we're starting to find that it is not real. So what do I mean by that? Basically, what we are starting to find as we literally pick apart brains and as experiments are done, what neuroscientists are finding is that you don't need to have your physical brain to continue to be conscious. Now, this is where things get weird, right? So that's the basic claim. You don't necessarily need parts of your brain to operate as essentially a full-fledged human. In fact, there are even medical stories of people literally missing a huge chunk of their brain, like almost an entire left or right lobe. And these people, they did not even realize that they were missing that until they got a CAT scan one day because they had a headache or something. And the doctor was like, dude, what is going on with your brain? And they're like, what are you talking about? And then the dude points to the x-ray and he's like, where is it? And the guy's like, what the You see what I'm saying? But there's cases like this. What cases like that prove is that you don't need your brain to be conscious, right? Your consciousness is not being generated in a particular lobe in your head. Because if somebody's missing a huge chunk of it, how are you still conscious, right? You would think that you would need the brain in its full capacity operating to generate your consciousness, right? That's what it should be doing. We find the exact opposite. So if you have a materialistic perspective on consciousness and you think it originates in the brain, the science does not support that. So that's one hell of a concept, right? If you are missing a huge chunk of your brain, in this case, like an entire lobe, then what does that say about consciousness? What does that tell you? I mean, if consciousness originates in the brain, then you don't, and if you're missing half your brain, as a materialist, what do you do with that concept? That really throws a monkey wrench into your entire concept of consciousness, right? Basically, what that means is part of your brain is completely irrelevant, apparently. As long as you have half, you're still conscious. All right. Anyway, so the materialistic side has problems. Another problem with the materialistic side is that neuroscientists have measured, and this is measurable, which is fascinating. They have been able to scientifically measure, and they've done this a ton, so there's no reason to be skeptical. I mean, be skeptical, but these experiments have been done over and over. They are able to measure that you will make a decision before you make a decision. Now that is insane. That's pretty crazy. What that means is that a decision has already been made to make your decision before you knew you would make that decision. This is one of the ones I find the most fascinating. The reason why this is crazy is because what this experiment scientifically proves is that basically something else is making a decision for you to make the decision. That's crazy. Now that's insane. Now that's going to transition us over to the other side of consciousness and one of the other main theories of consciousness. That's like 5 consciousnesses in like 10 seconds. That means soon we will all be drunk enough to go and take a massive dump in our neighbor's yard and then tell him that he could suck on these nuts. Now, one of the other popular theories regarding consciousness is the transmission theory. Basically, what this theory states is that the brain is not generating consciousness itself. The brain is acting as a receiver, and there is a signal, quote unquote, I'll say signal. There is a signal that the brain is receiving that then it will operate on in the real world. Now, this is the perspective that I find fascinating. The reason why it's fascinating is that if the brain is indeed a receiver, then that means something has to be sending a signal. Now, before you consciousness everywhere, experiencing consciousness in itself, people come out of the woodwork and start saying, well, yeah, that's just consciousness experiencing itself. No, that doesn't even make sense in that context. Do not start with me. All right, no. The reason why this concept is important to history, in my opinion, this is my opinion now, this is speculation. I will always tell you when I'm speculating. But here's the deal. if humans are created by something, not a god, but let's just say humans were created by, well, let's say humans were created by what some of the stories talk about. Humans were created by another physical being, another biological being. And make no mistake, when you look at those ancient texts and those oral traditions, this is a common theme that we find. We find that something is creating us, and that something is generally humanoid in essence. That is another part of the story that is extremely important. Right? So Abrahamic religion people will know, man was created in the image of God or whatever, right? But that theme is very prevalent throughout many ancient texts and ancient cultures. It is not just an Abrahamic religion situation. In fact, you can easily argue that the current Abrahamic religions that we have right now stole those ideas from the people way back in the day, or those stories were converted over, right? Or they were just shoved into the Bible, even though it didn't have anything necessarily to do with the Bible in the sense of what the Bible was trying to convey, right? They were just reusing those old stories. But that's just another point in favor for these old texts being real and being the originals, right? The newer texts, they draw on the older stuff. Yeah, okay, anyway, that's another show entirely. Anyway, a common theme is that we have what could be described as a humanoid type figure, another humanoid creating what we call mankind now. All right. So let's roll with this. Now, so first of all, before you turn this off, I know it's almost over, but before you turn this off, bear with me. If you're thinking, well, that's ridiculous, what are you talking about? Some other, aliens or something? Ooh. No, I haven't said anything. All I've said is humanoid. But let's look at it from this perspective really fast. When we look at humans, when we look at what creates a human, what do we find? We find the DNA molecule. The DNA molecule is comprised of a ton of amino acids, arranged in a very particular order. And we, of course, know scientifically that order is what dictates what kind of life will come out of that DNA. Because of this code, that means that we are able to go in there now and edit the code to get different results. Now, I don't think anybody in a scientific mindset is going to argue with me on that. Now, if DNA can be altered like this and in this fashion, it is not scientifically invalid to say that a different kind of being, in this case, we can even just say a higher level human, manipulated the genetic code, or they may have even created it for all I know. I don't know. But let's have some fun. Let's just say that, hey, look, another kind of humanoid created mankind, just like all the ancient stories say, and in the process of creating mankind, one of the things that has to be imparted upon that particular biological entity, us as humans, is consciousness. Now, a certain level of consciousness seems to be required to really consider yourself in the human, the human genome or whatever, right? So when we look at humans, we all understand that we are all conscious to a very certain level. We are also well aware that there are other consciousnesses that we would consider quote-unquote lower to us in other kinds of animals, etc. We can argue for consciousness to some degree in animals. The point here is that those animals are genetically built just like humans are, out of the same code. That means that you could technically have another kind of a humanoid thing, whatever you want to call it. If they know how to manipulate and or create, a genetic code, they could create humans. And then in the process of that, for some weird reasons, consciousness is part of being, a life form. But the question now has to be asked is why? Why is consciousness part of being a life form? I mean, we have stories and theories out there that some of you are probably already thinking about SchizO, for example, right? That humans were created by the Anunnaki and then they were used for slaves and blah, blah, blah. But why give human slaves consciousness? If they have that level of control, what's the point? And this is key. What is the point of consciousness? If we are going to assume that we are created by something else, why impart consciousness? What if consciousness is simply a certain kind of means of control. Right? Now, this is just one idea, by the way. I'm not saying this is the fact. It's just something to think about. If consciousness is not originating in the brain, if it is indeed being broadcast to humans all over the planet, then what is the source? First of all, now I don't know. I don't know what is the source. What the hell is broadcasting consciousness is the first question. And you could come up with all kinds of things, right? You could say, well, I don't know, there's some sort of supercomputer mainframe somewhere broadcasting consciousness, or some dude on the dark side of the moon broadcasting consciousness. I don't know, you could come up with anything. The point remains is that it's possible that consciousness may be being broadcast. If consciousness is being broadcasted, that's a good point in the favor of humans being created by a different biological entity. You know, if you think about it, I mean, it takes more than just DNA. You can take DNA and you can obviously build up a physical human biologically. But if we follow the science, we have no reason right now to believe that consciousness is originating in that biological matter, right? It certainly is starting to appear that consciousness simply is received by the brain. Now, if you are a creator and you're creating humans to do things, what's a really good way to control humans? Now, you can use, physical stuff to try to control humans. You can throw chains on them, or you can whip them, or you can do, whatever. You can do that kind of control. But how effective is that control? How effective is that control relative or versus being able to broadcast their orders straight into their brain? Like, which is more effective, right? Having control of a transmission would be optimal, because then you can basically broadcast whatever you want to your creation, and then your creation will do as you please. Now, this is the fact that it is possible at all, scientifically, by the way. I'm talking pure science here. Everything I'm saying here is scientific. Actually, let's do, okay, the fact that the possibility that the brain is a receiver in any capacity is amazing, right? That's awesome. And it's also being proven by mainstream science. This is not some weird alternative thing, by the way. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, just go look it up. It's easy to find. These experiments have been done en masse all over the place. So we find ourselves in an interesting position right here, right from the get-go, from a scientific perspective, right? We have no reason to doubt that you cannot control DNA. In theory, right now, there are probably scientists on this planet. They're probably creating humans right now, for all I know, but we know it's possible. This is not a scientific fiction. If a human right now can control DNA and create another human, however they kind of want to do it, then who's to say that a higher level of being didn't do the same thing thousands of years ago? And who's to say that our ancestors, or at least some of our stories from our ancestors, weren't recalling some of the memories of the creators themselves, telling them to humans, which would in turn give those stories that perspective, right? Because if you have higher level humans just conveying some stuff to other humans, and maybe even other humans actually saw people being created to one degree or another, for all I know, it's possible, right? Suddenly those creation stories start to make more sense. And if everybody has them all over the planet, then something is going on. That is some serious stuff right there. And this is all science. That's the crazy thing about this whole thing. Everything I just said is 100% based on science. So when we start to put creation stories in the context of a creator creating humans in a biological sense, suddenly that whole weird, fantastical, fictional side of things goes away. Now, consciousness. Okay, so fine, we're created and stuff and they're broadcasting consciousness, but why? Well, I already talked about the control aspect. But what's interesting is that throughout the histories, the story goes that eventually the creators disappear, don't they? The creators, they don't really hang around anymore. And for those of you that are still religious and still hold true to a God, you can say, well, my God is still here. And you can say that, but nobody can see him, right? You have to have faith that he's there. I would say that the concept of God nowadays would be an echoing of what used to actually physically exist back in the day, right? The newer religions that talk about gods in the sense of a god in the sky, a mystical sort of a situation, an omniscient thing, that's a newer phenomenon. Because don't forget, the further back we go, we don't see gods in the sense of a god today. We see gods are actually planets, right? They're not gods. Like, that's not what we find. Anyway, and there's various aspects to the creation that make things complicated. Anyway, so if we have a being creating humans for whatever purpose, consciousness, for some weird reason, appears to be intrinsic. If consciousness is being transmitted into humans, that means there's a transmitter. That means that we might actually have an explanation for what consciousness is. Is it possible that consciousness, that what we consider consciousness, is nothing special? It's just how we've been designed to exist so that we can function on the planet, or in existence, I guess, in general, right? And if we were designed to function a very specific way for certain things, that would make sense why our consciousness isn't as high as we can imagine it being. Okay, I've lost track. Okay, so, all right, so if we can imagine a higher level consciousness, let's look in our history texts really fast and see if anybody else has been able to achieve that, right? And sure enough, when we go back through history, consciousness and achieving higher levels of consciousness is a legitimate thing, right? This is a practice that has gone back in time since the beginning, literally since the beginning. But the question is why? Why would anybody even be trying to obtain a higher level of consciousness back in the day? Like, and I'm talking thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, when all the mainstream thinks that we were monkeys and just scratching our butts all day. But these people back then, they are already focused on trying to obtain a higher level of consciousness. Now, why would they do that? There's a good chance that the reason why they did that is because their ancestors' lived in a time where a higher level humanoid existed who literally right in front of them, they knew that humanoid had a higher level of consciousness. They could see it. They knew for a fact that a higher level of consciousness exists, right? But the question is, how do you obtain that, right? And there's all kinds of, attempted methods to do stuff. Meditation seems to be very, very, very important, and I highly recommend that. But how high can you really go, right? If your brain is a receiver, that means you can only receive to a point. Doesn't matter. There could be all kinds of other conscious signals out there right now, right? There could be higher level conscious signals going right past you. But if you do not have the right brain to receive that signal, you physically cannot reach that higher level of consciousness. And that might actually be why we have the problems we have. People trying to find that higher level of consciousness, they're probably not prepared to hear the fact that, hey, dude, you know what? You are this kind of a human. You're a human. You're what you are, and what you are, your model of human, you're not biologically designed to receive the signals that you are trying to tap into, which means you will never be able to tap into them. People, that's not something you want to hear. That kind of ruins a lot of stuff, right? But on the flip side, you can say that humans can obtain maybe a higher level of consciousness to a point. Now, this is what I find interesting, because your brain can be trained to do things. Your brain is very plastic. It molds, and you can mold it. And as you mold it, you are physically changing the structure of your brain. Does that mean that as you physically change the structure of your brain through, say, something like meditation, is that advancing your reception possibilities? Right? Hey, I'm just saying it might be possible, because if you can physically change your brain, and you can, that means you might literally be able to receive a better signal. And maybe that is where the slightly heightened level of consciousnesses can come from when you do those kinds of practices. See, now I'm just talking, I'm just going, this is just me talking out of my butt. But I'm just saying, this is a real possibility. You can't say this couldn't happen. I mean, the science is right there. I mean, okay. So if, okay, all right. So if the brain is receiving, and we can maybe mold our brain to get a higher level of consciousness, it begs the question, then what else is being transmitted? I mean, what level of consciousness is being transmitted? Another thing that's funny about consciousness and this transmission idea that I'm pulling out of my butt right now, what if there is a consciousness transmission emanating into existence, right? Let's just say planet Earth. Let's just say the transmitter's, I don't know, at the center of the Earth. I don't know. I have no idea. Doesn't matter where, but it's just affecting Earth, right? Okay, so everybody's getting this signal. But what if the brain can also send a little bit of a signal as well? Right? What if there's a small bubble of a signal that you can send? Right? So you ever get that feeling? You ever get weird feelings around people? I mean, you could say, hey, you ever feel love for somebody? Like you immediately fell in love with somebody and out of nowhere. You never talked to them, you barely saw them or whatever, and immediately there was like this energy. What if that's the transmissions being shared between the biological brains, right? What if that's what that is, right? We talk about, energies and weird stuff like that, but what if they're real, physical, tangible things that we as our current biological structure is created? What if that's how we're able to send and receive? And once you augment that, that's why maybe people can feel more or less depending on how they are physically, attuned to things, right? It's like an antenna. You can cut a piece of antenna off and get different frequencies, right? You physically change it. If you physically change your body, if you physically mainly change your brain, does that emanate different? Will that increase your signal? Is that where, say, what is that crap called? Where people really like you? Charisma. You're very charismatic, right? Anybody can be charismatic. Your looks play a small part, but hey, that's still the physical way, right? I mean, you're still attuning yourself to something. Like, what if the whole body is a receiver, right? I don't know. It's possible with the brain just being the core reception intent. I don't know. But a charismatic person doesn't have to be the ideal standard of beauty, right? You don't need to have that. A charismatic person can look basically like anybody, but will have a very particular energy that they radiate out. Yeah, maybe that's what that is. I don't know. Okay, all right, I'm still talking. All right, so anyway, my main point is that consciousness may not be as crazy of a thing as people want to believe. By that I mean, it may not be, we're all experiencing each other's consciousness, is consciousness experiencing itself. It may not be that grand, right? It also may not exist materialistically in the brain. It may not be that simple, right? Because we have no evidence that it begins in the brain. We don't have it, or I should say that it materializes originally in the brain. We don't have any evidence for that. Right? So suddenly, if we decide to say, hey, look, let's look at the science, and we look at the transmission theory aspect of consciousness, and then if we look back and, at our ancient historical records, we can see that maybe this is why consciousness exists. Maybe this is where it came from. Right? And unfortunately, and this people may not want to hear this, but consciousness might not be anything other than a quote unquote mechanical tool to keep the physical human body running. Right? I mean, that might be all it is. Everybody keeps trying to ascribe these amazing things to consciousness because, the brain thinks it's amazing, right? So this is a human perspective. This is not a reality-based perspective. A reality-based perspective shows you that humans really may not matter at all, and that it's possible that humans are simply biological tools. You may think consciousness is this great, all-amazing, all-encompassing thing, but the reality is, just because you find it amazing, the existence may not care about it, right? And to make matters even more interesting, it's entirely possible that another kind of a life form could simply have a higher level conscious than you could ever achieve anyway, right? And nobody ever talks about that stuff that often. That's entirely possible because people don't want to hear it. People don't generally people don't want to hear that you're the lower level life form compared to something else out there. right? That would be pretty ego destroying for a lot of people, I believe. Okay. Okay, so that's enough SchizO stuff here. All right, so yeah, you see what I'm saying? Like, if we look at ancient history kind of corroborates what consciousness might really be. And what consciousness might really be is not what you may want it to be. I mean, you know, that's, what do you want from me? That's what it might be. It might just be, it might be a tool that's used to create, to control, or to keep humans operating like we do. But there's no reason to believe that consciousness is this high almighty thing. It could just be a very standard, we might even have the crappy model of it. What do you think about that? We might actually have the garbage consciousness experience, right? Did you get all of that? Do you understand now what might be consciousness, or what consciousness might be? I gotta stop this crap. All right, this is long enough. Yeah. I don't even know why I record this.